So I want to acknowledge a couple of special guests that are with us today. Special to me, my parents, Herman and Nancy Riecke, and I've lost, there you are, right in the middle. Stand up, stand up, stand up. So, well, you don't even know why you're clapping for them yet, but I appreciate it, I really do. They just celebrated on Sunday their 63rd wedding anniversary. And I thought if I could acknowledge them in front of all of you, I will have resecured favorite child status, at least for the rest of the week. I'm back on top of Peter, my brother, I think, unless he's been over to their house to repair something recently that I don't know about. In that case, maybe I haven't resecured that spot. But I think with what we're talking about today and the family and legacy, it's special to me to have them here today. So I want to talk about finding meaning in suffering. And I want to start off in a very practical way by asking you to think about the person in your life, someone who has died, that you miss the most. And I want you to be brave and to go into some of these thoughts with me for just a minute. And I want you to think not just of that person who's the most obvious. If you've had a spouse that has died, obviously a parent or both parents who have died. But I want you to think specifically today about the person who has died that you miss the most today. So sitting in here on the beginning of a summer season, enjoying what you've enjoyed so far today, with what's going on in your life and whatever season you're in right now, think of the person who has left this world, that has died, that you miss the most. And what I'd like to ask you to do is, in just a moment, to close your eyes and to think about that person. And I'm going to give you sort of 3 categories of thoughts that I want you to think about that person. And after we've done that, I'm going to ask for a few of you to share. Now, that means most of you won't need to worry about sharing. So if that's not you, you're off the hook. I'm not looking for a person from every table or you to even talk around the tables. But if we do have, I don't know if we have a stick mic available or 2, that would be great. Oh, right here. We'll do that after we've taken just a moment. So if you would, take a moment with me and close your eyes and think about that person that you miss the most today. And I want you to think about them in 3 different areas. I want you to think, first of all, about words that they've said. Maybe there's something that this person that you're thinking of said regularly, said often, or said at a particular point in time that was significant for you at a significant event. Or maybe there's something that this someone in your life said at a totally random time, and for whatever reason, when you think back on that person, you think of those words that they said on that day and in that place. The second category, as you continue to think of that someone that you're missing the most today, is I want you to think about something that happened, something they did, an action that they took, activities that they were a part of or that you were a part of with them. And so as you think about that person, think about something that happened regarding that person, something positive, something that you treasure. And last but not least, I want you to think about something tangible. Is there something that person gave to you, or maybe something you have that belonged to them, or something that reminds you of them that came from someplace else? Is there a physical, tangible object in your life? Maybe it's in your home. Maybe you carry it with you. Some of you may have something on your person right now that connects you to that person that you miss so much. What is that object, that something tangible that makes you think of that person? And what I want you to do now is refine your thoughts, because I've asked you to think about a lot of things, so I want you to pick out one set of words that they shared, or one thing that happened, an activity, an action that they took, or something tangible, a physical object that you actually can lay your hands on. Think of one of those things, and I want you to just lovingly hold that thought right now. And if you still have your eyes closed, if you would open your eyes. And I'd just like to have a few people share what that was that came to your mind. And it's okay. When we do these, sometimes our voice cracks a little bit, right? And that's okay. That's the way we honor the memory of the person that we care about and that we've lost. So if you're thinking, I would talk, but I'm not sure I'll be able to do it without my voice cracking, please don't let that stop you. Mine will crack at some point before the end, and I am done with puberty. It will have to do with emotion at that point in time, so please don't let that stop you. So if there's a memory in one of these categories, if you would raise your hand, Curtis is ready to run a microphone. Got a couple here in the middle.
My name is Jacqueline Scott. I thought about my dad. My father, when I was growing up, there are certain things that young ladies don't do this and young ladies don't. But when it came to tools and fixing things, he didn't say, well, you're a girl, you don't have to do that. He taught me about tools. He taught me how to take care of them. He taught me that with a tool, if you buy the right tool, it'll last you the rest of your life. And so thinking about him, when I've done things after I left home, the first time I fixed my vacuum cleaner by myself, I felt good because of my dad. Because I know I would have paid a lot of money to have it fixed. And so now whenever I do something or fix something, I think about my dad and I try to find small ways to honor him by doing things with tools.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Go ahead.
My name is Frances Brooks, and there's that crack you mentioned.
Thank you for getting to it early. I appreciate that.
My best friend in this world as I was growing up was my grandmother, who I'm named for, Helen Frances Peel. And that woman was a card shark.
Okay.
But the thing that I appreciate that she invested the most was the time that we spent over that silly game of solitaire or war. For many of you in the room, we would play for hours, and that's what our best friends look like. And so I'm appreciative for that memory. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you. Got several more on Bernie's side.
There's a friend of mine whose dad is a pastor, and he played a significant role in my life as I grew up. And I lived with him for a while. And me and his son, in the madness of our late teen years, going into college, we were just living completely outside of Christ. And he used to try to sit us down and counsel us all the time. And I remember over several times, but one significant time, he pulled me aside and he sat me down in the madness of my life, and he used to ask me, he's like, do you love the people around you? Do you love them girls? And I'd say, yeah, of course. And he used to look at me all the time and say, love is what it does. Love is what it does. And he didn't scold me, he didn't hit me with the Bible, but he just kept looking at me and said, love is what it does. And when I got saved, maybe 2 months after the last time I heard him say that, those words were ringing in my mind. Love is what it does. And to this day, I'll never forget his statements on that alone.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that.
My name is Nicole Marsden, and the person that I miss the most is my grandfather. And he always wore Old Spice. And I remember one of the last times that we had a family event, we'd always get a big hug, and you say your goodbyes. And I remember laying down and smelling the Old Spice. So I just loved Grandpa's Old Spice.
Yeah, let's connect afterwards, because there's a little tiny part of my book that I thought was dumb until you just said that. And I want to show that to you and give you that, because I appreciate you saying that. Okay, maybe 2 more. Can we do 2 more?
My granddad was Elmer Gohey, a lifelong teacher. When I say lifelong, he was hired as schoolmaster at a little one-room school out by Huntertown at the age of 18, right after he graduated from high school. His career lasted 47 years, most of it teaching junior high science at Forest Park, which still exists. Just passed it a few days ago. But he had 2 little plaques on either side of the blackboard, and it really was a blackboard, not a chalkboard, whiteboard. It was a blackboard. Both of them irritated me when I was a little guy. One of them said, Don't make excuses, make good. And on the other side of the blackboard was can't, never did anything. I think that one's particularly appropriate today. Can't, never did anything.
Can I ask, how long has it been since you've seen those plaques?
Oh my, 60 years?
And you remember exactly what they said?
Oh, absolutely.
Wow. Wow. Okay. One more? We got a couple of hands.
My son Cliff passed in 2012. He was a great thinker. He was also a poet. And he would always say to me, Mom, live while you're alive. Life is not constrained or construed or collected in objects and things around the house, but in the experiences you create. I miss him greatly, and he wrote a poem for me many years ago when I turned 70. And so that hangs on the wall, and every day I thank God for him and his great memory. He gave me a lot to think about.
Wow, so powerful, so powerful. I think we've been taught by every one of these people. Don't you feel that way? That just by hearing some of what was shared, we've been taught by them, hearing their voices from beyond, encouraging us and leading us. So thank you for those of you. I know it takes courage to stand up and to say some of the things you did. Can we have a round of applause for everyone that shared those things? I think part of what we're thinking about right now has to do with grief, right? And I'll talk a little bit about that as we go along. And as you may know, I lead a team of chaplains at Parkview that we intersect with every death that happens at Parkview, from a mama who's 6 weeks along and miscarries to the 110-year-old hospice patient. And so that's a place where we intersect, and that's going to come up a few times through this. But I don't really necessarily want to focus totally on grief, even though we're talking about those memories of people that have died. This is the image that I want to focus on today. The image of passing the baton from one generation to the next. And not just simply a generational passing the baton, but a passing the baton even from our children to us when our children precede us in death. From our spouse to us if our spouse precedes us in death. And from one person to the next, how do we do certain things? How do we implement certain things, maybe even purposefully, so that we can pass that baton from one person to the next? And so the resource that I'm primarily drawing from is this book that I put out earlier this year, and really want to go into how do we do this? Because I think what we've just heard and what we've just felt as people, and I know you felt things as people shared this, what we felt is we know that this is important. We know what this is when we recognize it. When we see it, we know what it is, and we know how significant it is to hear Old Spice. How many of us could smell Old Spice as soon as she said that? You could smell it. You could almost feel the experience of being with somebody who has that scent about them. We can recognize the value of it when we see it, but to purposefully and proactively try to do things that are going to mean something like that to those that we leave behind when we die is a different story. Many of us are not very versed in how to do that. It sounds like you, sir, you had somebody who was speaking into you with love is what love does. You know, he understood. These are words I'm passing along to you, and they're going to be valuable for you now, but even after I'm gone, are still going to resonate with you. And I think we have a lot to learn from people like that as to how we do this. So we find meaning through these three things, I think: expressing words, taking actions, providing gifts. And those gifts aren't necessarily something of high monetary value. Having a poem on your wall or a plaque that used to be in a schoolroom, those things are gifts that we can provide to those that are going to be here after we're gone, that continue to provide meaning in their lives. They give us meaning, right? Because to give something like that to someone, I guarantee that when your son was writing a poem, it enriched his life as he gave that to you. And now it enriches your life now that he's gone as well. And so we express words, there's actions that we can take, and gifts that we can provide. So the book begins by talking about Viktor Frankl, and some of you are aware of the work by Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning. And if you're not, I want to give you 3 quotes that are going to tease you into wanting to read Viktor's book, and then 2 of his conclusions that are going to be important for us today. So he says, and if you don't know Frankl's story, he was a Jewish psychiatrist who was in World War II was imprisoned in a Nazi concentration camp, or as he called it, an extinction camp. His parents were both killed by Nazis. His wife was forced to have an abortion. Their first and only child was aborted through the state action, and then she was brought into an extinction camp that was separate from the one where he was. He went the whole duration of the war not knowing if his wife was dead or alive. When he finally was freed and the Allies had their victory, he discovered that she had been killed in that camp. And so if there's anyone who understands a bit of trying to find meaning in suffering, it would be Frankl. And he says, there's nothing in all the world I would venture to say that would effectively help one to survive even the worst conditions as the knowledge that there is a meaning in one's life. He says we must never forget that we may also find meaning in life when confronted with a hopeless situation, when facing a fate that cannot be changed. And I know we are people who we don't grieve as those without hope, right? We have hope in every situation. But I have to be terribly honest with you, and I'm going to say something that you might not like to hear at all. There are times when trying to focus on hope actually hurts other people. And I tell you this because we lead a team, I'm a part of a team that responds every time someone dies. When we walk in a room and there's a dead person laying there, sometimes the focus is on hope, but sometimes that can be a very difficult thing to say. It can be a very difficult conversation when someone has already died. As Viktor Frankl says, facing a fate that cannot be changed. This is a situation I am facing right now that cannot be changed. And so how do I deal with this situation? Finally, the last quote, he says, life does not mean something vague, but something very real, specific, and concrete. Something you can actually put your hands on, a poem by a loved one, plaques, being able to fix a vacuum cleaner. I'm guessing for Jacqueline, there's probably tools still that exist that maybe were your dad's. And those things that you can hang on to, and you have those very specific and concrete, real and concrete items. So 2 conclusions of Frankl's. He says, finding meaning helps us to endure life's most difficult situations. When I'm in that room, when I've just learned that my baby has died or that my loved one has died and everything's falling apart, and I feel like I'm in what Viktor describes as a hopeless situation, a fate that cannot be changed, I have to find some sense of meaning. And let me say very briefly, when I'm talking about meaning today, I don't mean an explanation for what has happened. I don't mean saying, well, this is why your baby died. I don't mean saying, well, clearly your father had lived a long life and it was time for him to go. And things like Jesus needs another angel in heaven. I think sometimes those are confusing, if not even hurtful. So I'm not proposing any explanations for your pain or your suffering, but when we're in that fate that cannot be changed, how do we find little nuggets of meaning, significance, purpose to help us to carry on? Second of all, he says meaning is not general and vague, but as we've heard today, when I ask you to think of those things and you were able to bring those to the fore, playing a game of cards, playing a game of war, I guarantee if you sat down with a person and played that game right now, you'd be taken right back to those moments. That game and the movements, the specific sequence of cards is going to bring you into that connection with your grandmother. So how do we do this? How do we better be purposeful about passing the baton? How do we find a way that's going to help us to do that? So how do we find meaning? How do we pass the baton? Meaning contains at least these 2 characteristics: weight and permanence. About 5 years ago, there was a baby in our hospital. We'll call him Baby Moses. And Baby Moses, through situations that were unavoidable, a fate that could not be changed, did not have any family, not even a mother with him at the hospital. And the hospital staff and subsequently the state and the county were able to begin to put a network of people around Baby Moses to support him, to help make decisions for him, to provide for him. And chaplains were in the room often for this baby, even though there was nothing that could be done, no one we couldn't have a conversation with anybody. He was an infant. And about 8 or 9 days into his stay at Parkview, the call came that we knew would come eventually, but we were still dreading that Baby Moses had died. So I walked across the sky bridge that you see when you pull onto Parkview campus over to our family birthing area in our NICU, and I went upstairs to the place where baby Moses had died, and I walked in, and for the first time, he was unhooked from all the machines he'd been connected to. He was able to be drawn out of the incubator where he had been since he was born. And when I walked in the room, his foster mother, who had stepped into the situation lovingly and so caringly, was holding baby Moses. And Tracy Martin, and some of you know Tracy, she helped found Aaron's House, and she was instrumental in helping us make some decisions and figuring out some of the things that we were doing. Tracy said, "Patrick, how would you like to hold baby Moses?" in a way that I knew I could not say no. And I sat down on one of our beautiful, elegant vinyl couches in the NICU, and Tracy walked over and put baby Moses in my hands. About a month ago, Tracy sent me the picture that she took. You know, sometimes you open your email and you're surprised. That was one of those times, to open an email and see a picture come back almost 5 years later of yourself holding a 2 or 3 pound baby. There's times in life, and this was certainly one of the main ones for me, when the weight of the situation was not the same as the weight of the object, right? You've had those experiences. Perhaps you've had those experiences even here today. You're just singing a song, but it's something more than a song. You're just having a conversation or making a meeting in the back of the room, but it's not just a meeting. It's not just a conversation. So those items in our life that carry more weight than the weight they actually carry is part of how we find meaning. When I first started as a part-time chaplain, shortly after I had begun the job, I had a meeting with my leader in her office, and she asked me a question I could tell she'd been wanting to ask for a while. She said, "How are you related to Gladys?" Well, Gladys is my grandmother, and Gladys died when I was 12 years old. And so you can imagine I hadn't been asked this question for quite a while. I was in my 30s at that time. It had been many years. And I said, "Well, she was my grandmother." She said, "I thought so." She said, "When I was a young mother and I was trying to get my squirmy children to behave in church, one day I had just had enough, and Mass ended, and I was walking out the back. And as I did, a little older lady grabbed my arm. She said, 'Honey, I remember what it's like to try to corral squirmy little children in Mass, and sometimes by yourself, because my grandfather had died when my dad was still young.'" She said, from that week on, this woman shepherded me, helped me, encouraged me, let me know that I was seen, that somebody was noticing that this is a little bit of a difficult thing to do sometimes, to have children in church. She said, "That woman was your grandmother." All of a sudden, I felt so connected, a sense of permanence there for my grandmother, who hadn't been around in so many years, but all of a sudden she was very present in that moment. And sometimes there are those connections that give us a sense not only of greater weight than the situation seems to really deserve, but a sense of connectedness, a sense of permanence. So what we need is to find ways to find meaning that are specific and concrete and have this disproportional weight and permanence. So I want to tell you a story about a man named Robert. And then I want to give you a free resource to take the next step. Bernie said, make them do something. So I'm going to give you a tool to give you an opportunity to do some of the work that we're talking about. And at the end, we're going to look at the conclusion of Job. Not the opening of Job that we usually look at, but the conclusion of Job. Robert was a man who lived many years ago, and he was born in the southern United States. He grew up in an intact family that took him to church, and every Sunday they went to this little church with whitewood siding, a tall steeple, and a gravel parking lot. The pastor there was friendly with the kids, and in fact he had a bowl of candy on his desk and often some in his jacket pocket, and he would dispense that out to the children every Sunday, so much so that Robert and the other kids deemed him the candy pastor. And so they were interested in Jesus, but they were also interested in Smarties, and things like that. One Sunday when Robert was young, as he sat on the hard wooden pew near the front on the left-hand side of the sanctuary, he heard the candy pastor talk about the all-embracing God and the Father who cares for us and Jesus who died for us. And the candy pastor encouraged people, if you've never really given your heart to Jesus, if you've never really made that confession of faith, then right where you are today, just say these 3 words to Jesus: I trust you. Robert's dad barely caught him out of the corner of his eye and noticed when he looked down that little Robert was sitting there with his hands folded, whispering over and over, I trust you. I trust you. I trust you. Well, one of the other things that Robert noticed in the little church growing up was a little girl who sat in the back right hand of the sanctuary, and her name was June. And so he loved the candy pastor, he loved Jesus, he also loved June. And so he noticed her every Sunday, and they would make eyes across the sanctuary. And as he grew up, he and June began to exchange more than eyes across the sanctuary, and they started to date. And shortly after high school, they were married to one another as they stood in front of the candy pastor at the church with the white wood siding. Robert went right into the military, had a successful military career. They put off having children until after that time was over. And so when they moved back home, they started their family and immediately had one son and then another and a third. They kind of pioneered the concept of soccer mom and dad because all 3 of their boys ended up loving soccer. And so we've got maybe some soccer moms and dads in the room here. They were one of the first, to really do this sort of thing where you go from soccer field to soccer field. In fact, there was one year that their boys were all at the same high school, senior, junior, and freshman. And the boys all played for the same soccer team. And so they had some really good years sitting with the same parents, cheering on all 3 of their boys in the middle of the same soccer game. Shortly after their youngest son graduated high school and moved out of the house, June had a doctor's appointment that revealed some problems with her heart. She had another follow-up appointment and discovered that she was going to need to have open heart surgery. In that time, not every hospital could do that kind of surgery, and so they drove an hour and a half to a couple cities over where June would have this surgery, just the 2 of them. And Robert never forgot the feeling of when the cardiologist came out with a long face, took off his gloves, sat down, put his hand on his shoulder, and he said the words Robert did not want to hear. Robert drove the hour and a half back home by himself, brokenhearted. After that, grandkids did start to be born, and as many of you know, grandkids can buoy the spirits even when you're the most down as possible. But still, when they weren't around and they weren't in the house, it was a lonely home. Many years later, as the grandkids started to grow up, Robert had one of those unfortunate visits with his own doctor. And he received some news that he didn't want to hear about himself, now an older man. He decided he wasn't really ready to tell the kids what was going on, but he did start to make some plans, and he developed a secret mission. Robert wasn't much for words, but at the next get-together, he announced to his sons in a very ceremonious way, I'm going on tour again. He said, I'm going to go to all the important places that I've always wanted to go back to and to visit again. I had 4 duty stations overseas. 2 of them I hated. 2 of them I really enjoyed. I'm going back to the 2 I really enjoyed. I'm going to go visit those places again. I bought my airline tickets just last night. After I do that, he said to his boys, I'm going to come back home and I'm going to go to all the important places back here as well. They said, well, okay, Dad, whatever we could do to support you sounds like a great idea. Not sure where this is coming from, but we'll cheer you on. So he had a great time overseas, enjoyed visiting the 2 duty stations. He came back home and he started to see all the places that he remembered from growing up, but taking a purposeful time, often taking some of his family members along with him to go to some of these places. When he visited his childhood home, he sort of wished he hadn't, because the home was in a different state than it was when he was a child, of course, and the neighborhood had changed significantly, and it just wasn't how he remembered the home. As he was leaving, though, he did notice that the ice cream shop where he and June had their first date had actually been revitalized and looked like a really vibrant ice cream shop once again. So he decided, I'm going to come back and I'm going to visit that ice cream shop. He asked his granddaughter, Callie. Callie was the one that reminded him the most of June. He said, how about we go to this ice cream shop together? He thought this would be a fun grandfather-granddaughter activity together. Callie just recently got her license, so he took his life in his hands and asked her to drive to the ice cream parlor, which she did. successfully. As they got out and they sat down, and he was in that place where he was with June so many years ago, looking across a little metal grate table at a young lady that reminded him so much of her grandmother. This was the first place, and really the only place, where the emotions finally overcame Robert. And they shed tears. He shed tears first, and then Callie followed suit, and they finished their ice cream together. He announced to the boys there was one last place, and they were going with him. And they'd learned through this process that when Dad said this was what was going to happen, they needed to go along with him. And so he said, we're going one more place. We're going back to the high school where you guys played soccer. And so they did. And one of the boys brought along a ball, and they went out on the field. There was nobody else there. They started kicking the ball around. Robert called from the stands, "You were better in high school." But they lost count of how many times they said, "Remember the time that, remember the time that." At the end of their time there, Robert said, "There's one last place." And he started to walk out. But he didn't walk towards the cars that they had come in. He started to walk in a different direction. They said, "Dad, we parked over here," and Robert kept walking. They got a few steps down the road, and they looked up in front of them, and they could see a dilapidated white steeple rising in the distance. They realized that just a short walk from the soccer field was that white church where their parents had been married, where their dad had met Jesus so many years ago. His middle son said, "Dad, you know the church is closed." Robert didn't answer. He just kept walking. They reached the church, and the oldest son was trying to peer in, and they noticed that the gravel parking lot was being taken over by weeds and by grass, and he's stretching to look in at the edge of the parking lot to see a glimpse of that sanctuary that he remembered as a boy, when a voice from behind them said, "Gentlemen, may I help you?" And they spun around on their heels, and Robert walked up to the man who had approached them and started telling them all sorts of stories. At this point, he was becoming a very good storyteller as he visited these places and brought back these memories. And so he launched into stories about being there as a child and being married there and taking their kids there. And at the end of the stories, he pulled out a yellowed piece of paper. He said, "In fact, look at this." And he unfolded it, and all the boys kind of came around like, "What does Dad have with him here?" And he said, "This is my baptismal certificate." And at this, the gentleman who had walked up on them while they were trying to look in suddenly seemed very interested in what was going on. He took the baptismal certificate and he said, "David Peabody?" And Robert said, "The candy pastor." He said, "Sir, my name is Gordon Peabody. David's my grandfather. I've been keeping an eye on the church ever since it closed for the family, and I noticed that you were here, and so I thought I'd better make sure you weren't trying to do something you shouldn't do here at the church." He said, "But after you've told me what you've told me, I do have keys to the church if you'd like to go inside and have a look around." Robert's eyes brimmed just a little bit, and he said, "Would I ever?" So Gordon went and got the keys and unlocked the church, and they walked around, and there was a thick layer of dust, but the sun shone in from both sides and just shone this great beauty of this old church with these wooden pews. They were in the back after having walked through most of the church, the boys and Gordon, while Robert sat down in that place on the front left of the sanctuary, and he bowed his head, and they stopped just long enough to be able to hear Robert say, "I trust you. I trust you. I trust you." They prepared to leave. Gordon went over to a stack of hymnals that sat in the back, and he said, "I want each one of you to take one of these so that you have something, a memento from the church." And they walked out with the hymnals. 3 weeks later, when no one could get a hold of Robert on the phone, his youngest son was the one that showed up to the house, let himself inside to find what he felt in his spirit he knew he would find, that his dad had died in his sleep. He sat down on the edge of his bed, looked over at him, and he squeezed his hand. He said, "Well, I think you did it, Dad. You visited all the important places." He looked up, and sitting right next to Robert on his nightstand was a dusty old hymnal. How do we do this? How do we follow the model of some of the people that you've shared about? How do we follow the model of Robert. We have to find things that are specific, like a card game, like Old Spice, like fixing a vacuum, like a hymnal, specific and concrete, things that have weight, that have a sense of permanence, that aren't just here today and gone tomorrow. They're not just the latest Instagram story that will be gone the next time you go there, but have a sense of permanence. I have good news and I have bad news, and you can probably predict what the bad news is. Your time is limited. Maybe this isn't as bad a news after all, but your time is limited. But you can express a word, take an action, or provide a gift. I'm going to give you a tool that's going to help you do that. So if you'll take out your phones, if your phones haven't died yet today, I realize we're late in the afternoon, so some of the batteries are starting to wane, but if you've still got a phone that has some charge, if you open up your browser, I'm going to give you a tool through my website that's going to give you the list of the 101 ways straight from the book, that's going to generate some thoughts for you on ways that you can do this, that you can pass that baton from one generation to the next. So to get you started, if you go to this website, it's my name, it's a little difficult to spell, so it's on the screen. Bernie sent me the initial slide to introduce me, and I had to correct my spelling of my last name on it, which is not the first time that's happened. So it's on the screen. If you go to that website, patrickriecke.com, you're going to see just very simply a place that's sign up for an email newsletter. And when you sign up for that email newsletter, you're going to get an instant reply that's going to have a PDF that has every one of the 101 ways to find meaning in suffering, 101 ways. Robert's story generates just a small part of that list, and ideas that are going to get you started on thinking, how do I hand this baton? How do I find these ways that are specific and concrete? Chances are there's probably not one thing on that list that's actually going to be the thing you're going to do. But if you peruse that list, it's going to generate an idea that's as specific as Old Spice or a card game or a hymnal. You're going to get this in your inbox. Some other resources that are available at the table. I've done a horrible job actually being at my booth, so I apologize for that, but there are some resources there as well. Many of you are familiar with the story of Job. But I will admit that I encountered a little line at the end of the story of Job in the past few weeks that I was not familiar with. And that's what I'd like to share with you to conclude today. We know that Job had many trials. We know the story of Satan appearing before God and asking to put him through these trials. We know that his friends were comforting at the beginning. We often forget this part. They went and sat with him quietly for 7 days and were with him in the midst of his pain. And then we know they switched to not so comforting friends, as they had a lot of different ideas about explaining why Job was suffering so much. But then we come to the conclusion. And you may remember the second half of Job's life, and you'll remember maybe the first few verses here, but there's a little piece at the end that I think is for us today. The last chapter, getting into the last verses, says, "So the Lord blessed Job in the second half of his life, even more than in the beginning. For now he had 14,000 sheep." As a guy who's a city person, that doesn't sound like a whole lot of fun, but I'm sure it was good for Job. 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 teams of oxen, and 1,000 female donkeys. He also gave Job 7 more sons and 3 more daughters. Not replacements for the first, but 7 more sons and 3 more daughters. He named his first daughter Jemima. That's sort of an unfortunate name, in my opinion. The second, Keziah, and the third, Karen Hapuk. In all the land, no women were as lovely as the daughters of Job. And here it is. And Job, their father, put them, the daughters, into his will, along with their brothers. Job lived 140 years after that, so not a total of 140, after that, living to see 4 generations of his children and grandchildren. Then he died, an old man who had lived a long and full life. I do not want to sign up for the first half of Job's life. I would sign up for this part, not the camels, but the opportunity to invest in the next generation, the the opportunity to, if you think of a will, and I overheard Gary and Deb and Wallace talking about this just a little bit ago. When you think about a will, you're doing all three of the things we've been talking about, right? You're expressing words. There's things that you're saying there. You're expressing a gift. You're giving some kind of gift, and you're also taking an action. You're acting on behalf of those who are left behind after you. It's interesting to note, and this is sort of my feminist coming out just a little bit. In that day and time, women were not a part of wills. And you notice the scripture is aware of that fact. This is believed to be the most ancient book of the scriptures. In the most ancient book of the scriptures, the most ancient saint, our first model, our first person to learn from, who understood meaning and suffering, who understood going through difficult times and grief, he said, it's not just my boys that I want to watch out for. It's not just my sons that I want to invest in, that I want to have something to say to them, a gift to give them, actions to take for them. But my daughters deserve to be a part of this as well. And so as you consider who in my life am I investing in, look at the whole. Look at all those people who are looking to you, who are a part of your ministry or part of your life. And ask yourself, is there a way for me to have a word for them, a word that they'll be carrying with them many years later, a scent, an action, a game, a tool, a resource that we can pass on to them and pass that baton, that generation effect. So I want you, if I can be as specific as I can, this week, when you get that email and you've got that list or you're thinking back on what we've talked about today, to pick one thing that you're going to do, a word you're going to express, an action you're going to take, or a gift you're going to provide. Thank you.